The grand chamber of the concordance was a testament to stillness, a cathedral of silent light, an ancient stone carved from the heart of a fallen moon. Its ceiling was a dome of captured starlight, swirling nebulas, and the slow, majestic turn of distant galaxies held in a state of perpetual, silent motion. Around the central dais, where the lumina crystal of the high cyan pulsed with a soft, internal energy, floated the delegate platforms, each occupied by a being whose species had charted the void for millennia. There was no sound but the faintest hum of atmosphere regulators and the almost imperceptible chime of the stasis fields that held the platforms aloft. It was a silence born of gravitas, of immense pressure, the kind that precedes the breaking of a world or the birth of a war. High Cyan Thrax, his crystalline form refracting the soft light of the chamber into 1,000 fleeting rainbows, let his multifaceted gaze drift across the assembled delegates. He saw the rigid posture of the Zylosian Warmasters, their chitinous armor a dull, martial gray. He saw the shimmering, almost ethereal forms of the sylphid diplomats, their very presence a whisper of disquiet. He saw the stolid, unreadable visages of the Obolite mechanists, their thoughts as hidden as the workings of their own complex machinery. For cycles, this chamber had been a place of unity, of carefully negotiated peace. Now it was a vessel for a singular, pervasive fear. The fear had a name, the Cathar Crimson Dominion. They were a tide of biological horrors, ships grown from living bone and fueled by solar plasma, and they were consuming the periphery worlds with a mindless, insatiable hunger. Every report was the same. Entire systems silenced, their populations rendered into biomass, their planets scoured to bedrock. The Concordance, for all its ancient wisdom and collective power, was losing. The data from the Hellion traverses confirmed. Thrax's voice resonated through the chamber, not a sound, but as a direct, psionically tuned vibration that each delegate perceived in their own mode of communication. It was a calm, level tone, but beneath it lay the weight of countless lost lives. Sector Gamma 9 has fallen. The Cathar fleet did not pause, they did not consolidate. They simply fed and moved on. Their trajectory remains constant, aimed directly at the Corward trade spines. A low, grating hiss came from the Zylosian platform. It was General Vorlag, his mandibles clicking with contained aggression. Our fleets are stretched thin, high cyan. The strategy of containment is failing. The Cathar do not operate with logic we can exploit. They do not have supply lines to cut or command structures to decapitate. They are a plague, and plagues must be burned out, not quarantined. And in the burning, what becomes of the world's already infected general? The lead Sylphid ambassador, Lyra, countered, her form wavering like a heat haze. Her voice was a melody of concern. We would be destroying the very people we are sworn to protect. There must be another way, a weakness we have not yet perceived. Vorlag's response was a wave of pure, contemptuous dismissal. Weakness? We have studied them for a full cycle. Their only weakness is that they can, with overwhelming force, be broken. Their strength is their numbers and their singular, terrifying purpose. Philosophy will not stop their maws from closing on another billion souls. It was into this suffocating impasse that a new piece of data was introduced. A junior Glypton adept, his crystalline form still cloudy with youth, projected a tactical map onto the central space above the dais. It showed the Cathar's crimson arrow of an advance. But now there was a new icon on the map, a single, impossibly small point of blue light, positioned directly in the path of the coming swarm at a critical gravitational choke point known as the Serpent's Coil. "What is this?" Vorlag demanded, his focus sharpening on the lone icon. "A probe, a sensor buoy. It is directly in the path of their main vanguard." "It is not a probe, General," the adept replied, his psionic tone laced with a tremor of uncertainty. "It is a vessel, a warship." A profound silence descended once more, deeper this time, laced with disbelief. A single warship, against the Cathar vanguard. It was not a strategy, it was an act of ceremonial suicide. Thrax felt a strange stirring within his ancient consciousness, a feeling he had not experienced since his own species' long-forgotten age of reckless expansion. It was a dissonant chord of curiosity and dread. "Identify the vessel," Thrax commanded, his voice holding the chamber in its grip. The adept hesitated for a fraction of a second. "High Cyan, it is human." The name fell into the chamber like a stone into a perfectly still pool. Human, the newcomers, the primitives from the Sol system, a species so young they still measured their history in the revolutions of a single plane. They had been granted associate status in the Concordance out of a sense of historical largesse, a paternalistic acknowledgement of their potential. Their technology was seen as rudimentary, their FTL drives brutishly inefficient, their ships small and unimpressive. They had offered assistance in the Cathar War, and the Concordance military had politely, condescendingly assigned them to minor patrol duties in quiet sectors, far from the real fighting. And now, one of their vessels was placing itself in the path of a force that had shattered entire battle groups of the Concordance's finest capital ships. One of their patrol cutters, Vorlag scoffed, a wave of derision washing from his platform. Are they insane? Did their captain misread his navigation charts? Recall them immediately. We will not be responsible for their absurd gesture of empty bravado. We have tried, General, the adept projected. They are not responding to Concordance hails. They have broadcast a single, system-wide message on a looping, unencrypted frequency. And what does it say? Lyra the Sylphid asked, her form shimmering with anxious light. The adept made a small adjustment, and a sound filled the chamber. It was a true audio transmission, a jarring and primitive method of communication that felt alien in the psionically linked hall. A voice spoke, calm and measured, female, speaking the formalized trade language of the Concordance with a flawless, yet strangely flat, accent. This is Captain Eva Rostover of the Terran Confederacy vessel Unbroken Silence. This vessel is now a designated zone of non-aggression. Any vessel entering this zone with active weapon systems will be considered a hostile actor. We are here to de-escalate the current conflict. We advise all non-combatants to maintain a safe distance. That is all. The message looped, repeating the same incredible, impossible words. Zone of non-aggression. De-escalate the conflict. These were the words of diplomats, of peacemakers, not of a lone, insignificant warship facing down a ravenous horde that communicated only in death. Vorlag's derision turned to fury. De-escalate? They seek to de-escalate a tidal wave of devouring flesh. This is madness, sheer, unadulterated biological madness. The humans are an infantile species playing with concepts they cannot possibly comprehend. Their arrogance will be their tomb. Thrax did not respond immediately. His mind was focused on the name of the ship, Unbroken Silence. It was a strange name for a warship. The vessels of the Concordance had names that spoke of power, of glory, of vengeance, names like Starbreaker, Indomitable Will, Grave of Empires. But Unbroken Silence, it suggested something else entirely. Not the roar of battle, but the quiet that comes after, or perhaps the quiet that comes before. He studied the tactical display. The Cathar swarm was a chaotic, furious smear of crimson energy signatures. The human ship was a single, placid point of blue, a period at the end of a sentence yet to be written. He felt a deep, instinctual unease. The Concordance had dismissed the humans. They had seen their physical fragility, their short lifespans, their emotional volatility, and judged them as ephemeral, a brief flicker in the long night of galactic history. They had not considered that these very qualities might forge a perspective utterly alien to the long-lived, stable races of the Council. A species that lives with the constant, intimate knowledge of its own mortality might view time, conflict, and life itself through a lens the eon-spanning Glyptons could no longer even imagine. What did a creature that lived for a mere century consider a worthy sacrifice? What calculus of risk and reward did they employ? Let them be, Thrax said, his decision solidifying into a command that silenced Vorlag's rising protests. The psionic weight of the High Scion's will was absolute. We will observe. All Concordance fleets in the sector are to hold their positions and watch. We will witness this human strategy. We will see what lesson they mean to teach, or what folly they mean to display. The delegates offered no further argument, though waves of disbelief, pity, and scorn still radiated from their platforms. They settled into a collective, silent vigil. The starlight on the ceiling of the grand chamber continued its slow, indifferent dance. And on the tactical display, thousands of light-years away, the crimson tide drew inexorably closer to the single, defiant point of blue. The silence in the chamber was no longer one of peace, but of profound galactic tension, the silence of a held breath. The fate of a sector, and perhaps the reputation of an entire species, was about to be decided in the cold, unforgiving void of the Serpent's Coil. The universe, it seemed, was waiting to see if the silence would break. The long-range sensor feeds trickled into the grand chamber, translated into visual data that shimmered in the air above. Deus. The Cathar vanguard was a horrifying spectacle even from this distance. It was not an organized fleet, but a living wave, a tsunami of biomechanical monstrosities. Their ships, if they could be called that, were asymmetrical nightmares of jagged bone spurs, pulsating organic sacs, and maws that glowed with the stolen energy of consumed stars. They moved without formation, a swarm driven by a singular, ravenous impulse, filling the void with a chaotic screech of high-energy emissions and gravitational distortions. It was the brute force of nature weaponized, an entire ecosystem retooled for consumption. And against this force of cosmic horror sat the unbroken silence. The visual resolution was poor, but the ship's design was starkly different from anything in the Concordance Armada. It was a vessel of clean lines and stark, geometric simplicity. A long, slender hull, a deep, non-reflective black, devoid of ornamentation or aggressive-looking weapon emplacements. It seemed less like a warship and more like a scientific instrument, a scalpel in a field of sledgehammers. It hung perfectly still in the void, its engines emitting only the barest whisper of energy, a stark contrast to the roaring, chaotic advance of the Cathar. General Vorlag's platform pulsed with a dark, satisfied fatalism. Their engines are cold, their weapon ports are sealed, they are not even attempting to power up for a fight. They are paralyzed by fear, a pathetic end to a pathetic gesture. Thrax did not share the general's certainty. The human ship was not broadcasting fear. Its energy signature was preternaturally calm. It was the calm of a deep ocean, hiding unimaginable pressures beneath its placid surface. It was the calm of a predator waiting, not the paralysis of prey. He focused his ancient consciousness, trying to feel, to intuit the logic behind this suicidal stillness. The humans were known for their creation of complex systems, their intricate networks of information and logic that they called computation. To the Glyptons, whose thoughts were like flowing crystal, it seemed a rigid and clumsy way of thinking. But perhaps, Thrax considered, in that rigidity lay a different kind of strength. A strength of absolute, unyielding precision. The first wave of Cathar ships, a vanguard of smaller, faster corvettes, entered the designated zone. On the display, a thin blue line shimmered into existence around the human vessel, marking the perimeter Captain Rostova had declared. The Cathar, of course, paid it no mind. They surged forward, their forward cannons, organic sphincters that spat gobs of corrosive plasma, beginning to glow with sickening green light. In the grand chamber, a collective intake of breath occurred across a dozen species. This was the moment of annihilation. But the unbroken silence did not fire. It did not raise shields. It did not move. Instead, something expanded from it. It was not a weapon. It was not an energy field in any conventional sense. It was a wave of data, a complex, multi-layered transmission of pure information that bloomed outwards from the human ship at the speed of light. The sensor adepts in the chamber struggled to interpret it. It was a signal of impossible density and structure, a fractal lattice of logic and resonance frequencies. The Cathar ships convulsed. The first rank, the ones closest to the human vessel, suddenly went dark. Their plasma cannons sputtered and died. Their bioluminescent hulls flickered and went black. Their engines, powered by miniature, caged singularities, ceased their gravitational roaring and fell silent. They simply stopped. They became inert, dead husks of bone and flesh, tumbling aimlessly in the void. The wave of information continued to expand. More and more Cathar vessels fell silent as it washed over them. Not a single explosion marked their demise. There was no fire, no shrapnel, no debris. They were not destroyed. They were turned off. Like a child's toys, their power sources disconnected. A gasp, a true, audible gasp, came from the Sylphid platform. General Vorlag's mandibles hung open, the grating sound of his aggression silenced by sheer, uncomprehending shock. The Obolite mechanists, for the first time in centuries, radiated a detectable psionic signature, pure, unadulterated astonishment. In the space of less than a minute, the entire Cathar vanguard, a force that would have required a full Concordance battle wing to engage, was neutralized. They floated dead in space, a silent, grotesque graveyard surrounding the placid, solitary human ship. The rest of the Cathar swarm, still beyond the range of the human ship's strange influence, seemed to react with confusion. The mindless, forward momentum of the swarm faltered. They milled about in disarray, their hive mind seemingly unable to process what had just occurred. A weapon that did not kill, a force that did not destroy. It was a concept so alien to their existence that it had deterred their collective purpose. Then a channel opened, a direct, secure comlink from the unbroken silence to the high science dais. The face of a human female appeared in the air before Thrax. She was pale, her dark hair pulled back from a face that was a mask of calm professionalism. Her eyes, a deep, contemplative brown, held no trace of triumph or arrogance. They held only a quiet, solemn focus. This was Captain Eva Rostova. "Hi, Cyan Thrax," she said, her voice the same one from the broadcast, cool and precise. "The immediate threat has been contained. We have established a null-energy zone around our vessel. The Cathar Vanguard is disabled, not destroyed. Their biological life support systems are intact, but their ship functions have been permanently severed from their neural command network." Thrax found himself, for the first time in his long existence, at a loss for words. His mind, capable of contemplating the grand arc of galactic history, struggled to process the tactical data in front of him. He looked at the dead fleet, then back at the calm human face. "Captain Rostova," Thrax finally managed, his psionic voice imbued with a new, profound gravity. "Explain, what weapon did you use?" "It was not a weapon, High Cyan," Rostova replied, her expression unchanging. "It was a diagnostic and override signal. We call it a logic bomb. We have spent the last standard cycle analyzing the Cathar, not their tactics or their armor, but their biology. Their ships are not machines, they are organisms. And like any organism, they have a nervous system. A crude but effective biodigital network that connects the crew forms to the ship form." She paused as if to let the impossible simplicity of her statement sink in. "The Cathar command network operates on a very specific set of resonant frequencies. It is powerful, but it is also monolithic. It has no firewalls, no security protocols, no error checking. It is pure, unfiltered command. We did not attack it. We simply communicated with it. We sent a signal that mimicked their own command structure, but which contained a recursive, paradoxical instruction. A logical contradiction that their system was not designed to handle. Their neural networks attempted to process an impossible command, and the resulting feedback loop overloaded and fused every primary system in their fleet. We did not destroy them. We forced them to shut themselves down." The chamber was a tomb of stunned silence. Vorlag, the great Zalosian warmaster who thought only in terms of megaton yields and shield capacities, looked as if he had been struck by a physical blow. The sylphids shimmered with a light that was no longer anxious but filled with a deep, reverent awe. The humans had not met force with greater force. They had met it with intelligence. A scalpel, not a sledgehammer. They had not fought the beast. They had diagnosed its ailment and administered a cure. You turned their own biology against them," Lyra whispered, her voice a fragile melody. "It was the most efficient and ethical solution," Rostova stated, as if describing a simple engineering problem. "To engage them with conventional weapons would have resulted in an immense loss of life on both sides. It would have been a waste of energy and resources. More importantly, it would have been a moral failure." This was the second shock, more profound than the first. To the Concordance, the Cathar were monsters, a plague to be eradicated. The idea of an ethical consideration in their destruction was a concept so foreign as to be almost incomprehensible. But the human captain spoke of it as a primary strategic objective. Thrax felt the foundations of his worldview begin to shift. For millennia, the Concordance had waged war based on a simple calculus of power. Who had the stronger ships, the more devastating weapons, the greater numbers? The humans operated on a different calculus entirely. A calculus of knowledge, of understanding, of empathy. They had looked at a monster and seen not a target, but a system to be understood. "Why, Captain?" Thrax asked, his psionic voice now carrying a tone of genuine, humble inquiry. "Why go to such lengths to spare a species that has only brought death and ruin to the galaxy?" The captain's expression softened just for a moment. A flicker of something deep and ancient, something that Thrax recognized as sorrow, passed through her eyes. "Because, High Cyan, we have learned a hard lesson from our own history. The greatest monsters are not always those who hold the sword, but those who forged it. We analyzed more than just the Cathar's biology. We analyzed the faint carrier wave signals buried deep within their hive mind chatter, the commands that drive them. They are not conquerors. They are puppets." She gestured to an adept on her bridge, and a new stream of data flowed into the Concordance's systems. It was a complex waveform analysis, a signal buried beneath layers of Cathar biological noise. It was elegant, precise, and utterly artificial. It was a control signal. "The Cathar are not acting of their own free will," Rostova explained, her calm voice delivering a revelation that would shatter the strategic landscape of the galaxy. "They are a slave race, their minds and bodies hijacked by a compulsion code, a signal that originates from a source deep within the Crimson Nebula. We believe the true enemy, the one responsible for the fall of Sector Gamma 9 and countless other worlds, is the author of this signal, a power we have designated Nova. The Cathar are merely their living weapon. To destroy them would be to destroy the victims of a crime, not the perpetrators. We came here not to fight a war, but to stop one from being waged against the wrong enemy. The full weight of her words settled upon the Grand Chamber. The war was a lie. The enemy they had been fighting with such desperation was a decoy, a tragic, bloody distraction. The real foe was a ghost, a puppeteer hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings of a monstrous army. And it was the humans, the quiet, underestimated newcomers who had seen the truth. They had not brought a warship to the Serpent's Coil. They had brought an instrument of revelation. The unbroken silence had not just defeated a fleet. It had shattered an illusion that held the entire galaxy in its thrall. Thrax looked at the face of Captain Rostova, at the quiet resolve in her eyes, and he understood. The humans were not primitives. They were not arrogant children. They were a species forged in a crucible of self-inflicted pain and hard-won wisdom, a species that had learned to look past the fist and see the mind that guided it. Their perceived weakness, their emotional depth, their focus on logic, their adherence to an ethical code, was, in fact, their greatest and most terrifying strength. The legend of the human warship was just beginning, but it was not a legend of firepower or conquest. It was a legend of clarity, of a truth delivered in the form of a profound and unbroken silence. The age of the Concordance's certainty was over. The age of human insight had just begun. The revelation brought forth by Captain Rostova did not merely alter the strategic calculus of the Concordance. It fractured the very soul of its ancient philosophy. For eons, the great races had operated under the assumption that the universe, while vast and often hostile, was ultimately knowable through the application of sufficient force and logical deduction. The Cathar were a problem of physics, a hostile mass with a given velocity and destructive potential. The solution, therefore, must also be one of physics, a counterforce sufficient to arrest their momentum. But the humans had presented a truth that transcended physics and entered the realm of metaphysics. The problem was not the Cathar's material form, but the intention that animated it. They had been fighting a symptom, while the disease festered unseen. In the days that followed the event at the Serpent's Coil, the Grand Chamber was a place of deep, introspective silence. The delegates no longer debated tactics, but ethics. General Vorlag, the proud Xylosian warmaster, was a changed being. The certainty that had defined his existence was gone, replaced by a brooding, thoughtful quiet. He spent his time not in combat simulations, but in reviewing the human data, his mind struggling to grasp a form of warfare where the primary objective was not destruction, but liberation. The Sylphids, who had always advocated for a more nuanced approach, now found their philosophies given a stark and powerful validation, yet even they were humbled by the sheer depth of human perception. They had sought a weakness in the Cathar. The humans had found a tragedy. High Scion Thrax initiated a series of prolonged communications with Captain Rostova. These were not the tense negotiations of allies of convenience, but the deep, philosophical exchanges of two minds trying to bridge a vast conceptual gulf. He learned of human history, of their own terrible internal wars, their struggles with ideology and control. He learned of their concept of asymmetric warfare, where a smaller, more agile force could defeat a larger one not through strength, but through understanding and exploiting the enemy's core principles. The logic bomb, Rostova explained, was a weapon born from their own digital age, a time when they had learned that the most secure fortress could be brought down not by a battering ram, but by a single, perfectly crafted line of code that turned the fortress's own defenses against itself. We learned that true power is not the ability to compel, but the ability to convince, Rostova's image explained from the viewscreen on the dais. Her ship, the Unbroken Silence, remained at the Serpent's Coil, a silent sentinel guarding its graveyard of sleeping monsters. The Nova signal is a form of absolute compulsion. It is a brute. Force command offering no choice. That is its strength, but also its critical flaw. It creates an army that is predictable, that cannot innovate or adapt. It creates a tool, not a partner. To defeat such a power, you cannot become like it. You must offer an alternative, choice, freedom. A new path forward began to form in the collective consciousness of the Concordance, a path illuminated by human thought. The goal was no longer to eradicate the Cathar, but to free them. A grand, impossibly ambitious plan was conceived. The humans would share the principles of their logic bomb technology and the Concordance's finest minds, Glypton psionics, Obolite mechanists, Sylphid signal weavers, would work alongside the crew of the Unbroken Silence to create a countersignal. Not a weapon to disable the Cathar, but a key to unlock them. A liberation wave that would sever the Nova's control and, hopefully, restore whatever consciousness the Cathar had once possessed. It was a monumental undertaking. Fleets were redeployed, not for war, but for a mission of rescue on an unprecedented scale. Research outposts were established in shielded nebulae, where the brightest minds of a dozen species collaborated with the small, quiet contingent of human scientists and engineers from the Unbroken Silence. The human ship itself became a legend, a symbol of this new way of thinking. Concordance crews, accustomed to the thunderous, intimidating presence of their own capital ships, would watch in awe as the small, dark vessel coordinated vast logistical operations with a quiet efficiency that was both unnerving and deeply impressive. The ship's name took on a new, profound meaning. It was the silence of focused thought, of a power so confident it had no need to announce itself with noise and fury. During this time, Thrax came to understand the true nature of human resilience. He had seen them as fragile, short-lived beings. Now he saw that their short lifespans gave them a terrifying urgency, an ability to innovate and change at a pace that left the ancient races breathless. Where a Glypton might spend a century contemplating a problem, a human team would iterate through 100 possible solutions in a single cycle. They were not afraid of failure. They seemed to treat it as a necessary part of the process of discovery. Their emotionalism, which the Concordance had mistaken for a weakness, was in fact the engine of their progress. It was their empathy for the enslaved Cathar that fueled their tireless work. It was their deep, historical fear of their own capacity for monstrousness that drove them to seek an ethical solution. Finally, the liberation wave was ready. It was a signal of breathtaking complexity, a symphony of psionic, biological, and digital frequencies designed to resonate with the Cathar mind and gently, persuasively, sever the parasitic bond of the Nova signal. The plan was to broadcast it from the Unbroken Silence, using the ship's unique projection systems, amplified by a network of concordance vessels, into the heart of the largest Cathar swarm ever detected, which was massing near the edge of the Crimson Nebula. The operation was tense. The entire Concordance held its collective breath as the fleets moved into position. The Unbroken Silence took its place at the heart of the formation, a small, black spearhead aimed at the heart of the galaxy's greatest nightmare. On the dais in the Grand Chamber, Thrax and the delegates watched the live sensor feeds. The Cathar swarm was a terrifying sea of crimson, a manifestation of pure, directed hate. "The wave is ready for broadcast. High Scion," Captain Restova's voice came, as calm as it had been at the Serpent's coil. "Proceed, Captain," Thrax commanded, his own ancient consciousness thrumming with a mixture of hope and fear. The signal was unleashed. A wave of pure, benevolent information radiated from the human ship, invisible and silent, but carrying within it the combined hope of the entire Concordance. It washed over the Cathar fleet. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The swarm continued its relentless, mindless advance. A wave of despair began to radiate from General Vorlag's platform. Then the change began. It started with the largest of the Cathar bioships, a behemoth the size of a small moon. Its threatening, crimson glow began to soften, shifting in hue from blood red to a deep royal purple. Its erratic, aggressive movements smoothed out, its bone spurs retracting slightly. Across the entire fleet, the same transformation occurred. The chaotic, screeching energy signatures died down, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum. The ships ceased their forward advance and began to reorient themselves, forming elegant, sweeping patterns in the void, like a flock of birds remembering an ancient, forgotten migratory path. A new communication came from them. Not the screeching psychic rage of the hive mind, but a chorus of voices, ancient and melodic. Ike filled with a profound, sorrowful gratitude. They were the Cathar, but not the Cathar the galaxy had known. They were the true Cathar, a race of sentient, spacefaring leviathans, ancient and wise, who had been captured and enslaved by the Nova signal for millennia. They had been passengers in their own bodies, forced to watch as their flesh was used to commit unspeakable atrocities. The relief in the Grand Chamber was a physical force, a tidal wave of emotion that shook the ancient hall to its foundations. They had not just won a war, they had corrected a terrible, cosmic injustice. They had liberated a soul. The Cathar, in their newfound freedom, pledged their allegiance to the Concordance and their human saviors. Their vast fleet, once a weapon of terror, now became a powerful, grateful ally. The war against the Crimson was over. But the war against the Nova had just begun. With the help of the newly freed Cathar, the Concordance traced the Nova control signal to its source. It was a single, impossibly powerful beam, originating from a point deep within the swirling, impenetrable gases of the Crimson Nebula. A joint fleet was assembled, a force unlike any the galaxy had ever seen, comprised of the sleek, functional vessels of humanity, the mighty warships of the Concordance, and the vast, living ships of the Cathar, their hulls now glowing with a peaceful, ethereal light. At its head, as always, was the unbroken silence. Their journey into the nebula was a descent into a roiling, chaotic hell. But guided by the now benevolent Cathar, who knew these spaces intimately, they navigated the treacherous currents and gravitational tides. As they drew closer to the signal's source, their sensors began to detect something. An object of impossible scale, so massive it was warping space-time around it, yet so dark it reflected no light and emitted no energy, save for the single, focused beam of the compulsion code. When they finally broke through the last veil of gas and dust, they saw it. It was not a planet or a star or a fleet. It was a megastructure, a perfect black sphere larger than any star system, its surface utterly smooth and featureless. It was a Dyson sphere, but built on a scale that dwarfed any theoretical model. It absorbed all light, all energy, all radiation. It was a hole in the fabric of reality, a monument to a level of technological mastery that was, to the Concordance, indistinguishable from godhood. This was the heart of the Nova. "We are detecting a massive power source within the sphere," Captain Rostova's voice reported, her calm tone now laced with a thread of pure awe. "But the compulsion signal, it is weakening. It seems to be failing, as if the power source that drives it is nearing exhaustion." As they watched, a section of the black sphere began to change. Cracks of faint, silver light appeared on its surface, spreading like fractures in obsidian. The single, powerful beam of the control signal flickered and died. A profound silence fell over the fleet's calm channels. They had arrived at the heart of their enemy's empire only to find it dying. Then a new signal emerged from the sphere. It was not a focused beam of control, but a broad, omnidirectional wave of information. It was not a weapon or a command, but a message. A recording, a final testament left behind by the beings who had built this impossible object. The human and Glypton linguists worked frantically to translate it. The message they uncovered was the final, universe-altering twist in a war they had never truly understood. The builders of the sphere, a species so ancient their name was lost to time, had not been conquerors. They had been wardens. The sphere was not a throne world, it was a prison. And inside it they had contained a threat of unimaginable horror, a non-corporeal, psychic entity of pure, malevolent hunger that had consumed entire galaxies in a previous cosmic cycle. An entity they called the Silent Hunger. They had managed to trap it, to build a cage of impossible scale and power around it, but they could not destroy it. The Nova signal, the compulsion code that had enslaved the Cathar, had been a desperate, automated defense system. It was designed to create a buffer zone, a wall of living flesh and ships, to throw against the prison walls in case the entity ever began to break free. The Cathar had not been a slave army for a galactic conquest. They had been mortar, used to patch the cracks in a cage holding back the end of all things. "High Scion," Captain Rostova's voice was grave, heavier than Thrax had ever heard it. The awe was gone, replaced by a chilling, solemn understanding. "The Warden's final message, it is a warning. Their power source is failing after millions of years. The prison is breaking. The compulsion signal was their last, failing line of defense. By freeing the Cathar, we have inadvertently dismantled it." As she spoke, the cracks of silver light on the black sphere widened. From within, not light, but a wave of pure emptiness, of profound psychic dread, began to pour into the void. It was an anti-presence, a feeling of being watched by an intelligence that did not recognize life as anything other than something to be unmade. The silent hunger was stirring from its eons of slumber. In the grand chamber, a fear colder and deeper than any they had felt during the Cathar War settled upon the delegates. They had defeated one monster only to unleash another, 1,000 times worse. They had been so focused on the puppets they had not understood the nature of the stage or the true play that was being performed. High Scion Thrax looked at the tactical display, at the combined fleets of 3 great civilizations, now dwarfed by the failing prison and the ancient horror it contained. He thought of the journey that had brought them to this place. It had all started with a single, small ship, a vessel whose name was Unbroken Silence. That ship had taught them to look past the obvious, to seek the truth behind the violence. It had become a legend by winning a war without firing a shot. Now that same ship and the quiet, thoughtful species that had built it stood with them before a new, final frontier, not one of space, but of survival against a cosmic absolute. The war against the Crimson was a footnote. The mystery of the Nova was solved. The legend of the human warship that had stood against them both was complete. But as Thrax looked out at the captured starlight swirling on his chamber's ceiling, he knew that this was not an ending. It was the terrifying, humbling beginning of a new, far greater story. A story that would be defined not by a war, but by a vigil. A vigil against the encroaching, silent hunger. A vigil that the newly united galaxy would have to hold together, under the leadership of a species that understood, better than any other, the profound power that lay in an unbroken silence. Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn, enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat.